And yeah, all you. You're
All
on.
me. Okay. So I'm trying to remember, like we had some really good questions the last time that we didn't even finish up. Did I email it to you? I think I emailed it to you. But it would have been like a month ago, right?
Yeah, I think it got zapped because my computer got zapped.
All right, I'll see if I can pull it up here in a second. However, regardless, if we need it, we'll go there. So you guys start typing in your Q&As or your Q's already. But I was sitting here thinking, and I swear we've talked a ton about this, and I thought maybe it's best that we revisit it. But I was thinking about it is interesting to me. And I think even if I can remember back to when I really first started learning about boundaries, and again, I don't know how many of you have heard me say it. I don't like the word boundaries, right? The word boundaries implies like a barrier, a wall, right? When the truth about it is, when we set boundaries, we are trying to teach somebody how we want to be treated. We're trying to teach them about our needs. And I struggle to say this. We're trying to also teach them about our wants and our preferences. Why I say it is, I think sometimes when it really comes down to it, boundaries are a lot stronger than just wants and preferences. But I think it's helpful to understand that our wants and our preferences are tied to needs. And needs are important. Needs are valuable. Wants and preferences are important. They're valuable. They help us understand ourselves. They help us understand others. They help us understand what we need and want from others. So, but in the beginning, I think oftentimes people that are in therapy kind of can be needless and wantless and unsure of, am I even allowed to have needs, or a complete misunderstanding of what their needs are and how to get them. And so teaching a person essentially to understand their needs is really clumsy. And we often feel very empowered when somebody says to us, you deserve kindness, right? And we go, wait, I deserve kindness? That's it. I'm going to demand kindness everywhere. And I'm going to demand it with energy and power and gusto. I don't know why I just came up with the word gusto in my head, but this idea that we suddenly have been given this gift of empowerment around being allowed to have needs, then we want to enact our boundaries on everybody. And the thing that I don't like about, one, the word boundaries, is that truly I share my boundaries, I share my needs with the people I am closest to. Now I share them with everybody, right? But I don't let a client know what most of my boundaries are. My clients know very few of my boundaries. One of my boundaries that I declare to clients is that that they have a 24-hour cancellation policy, right? That's what I currently have. And if they cancel outside of that, so 25 hours, I don't charge them, and I have to figure out how to fill my own appointment, right? And if it's under that, right, then they may have to pay for the appointment. And most of the time I tell them, I'm going to charge you. I'm a stickler. Don't stand me up, And so that's a boundary. But the truth is, I don't have a ton of boundaries with clients other than things that may, that may be socially implied, if that makes sense. But the people who I am closest to, the people who I have the most intimate relationships with, know know most or all of my boundaries, so long as I actually know it. And so the reality of it is, the healthiest relationships we can have are the most boundaried. But again, it sounds odd. The healthiest relationship I have are the closest relationships. And suddenly I had this thought pop into my head where I'm like, did we talk about this last time, Scott? Was this the exact same thing? Anyway, squirrel. So, I'm sorry. Scott's hilarious, even though you guys, I don't know that you can see him right now. So,
Just doing my impression of the dog from Up.
right, squirrel. So that's the best. Okay, so and it's weird, right? Because I kind of always had this idea that the best relationships I have, the closest relationships I have, are boundaryless. And because it's like, oh my gosh, that's the best relationship ever. But it's actually not, because somebody who I have the most boundaries with they're going to know my wants, my preferences, my needs, and they're going to be respectful of them. They're going to get to a place where they want to know my boundaries. They want to know what my needs are, and I want to know theirs, because then we have a more trusting relationship. We have a more compassionate, understanding, caring relationship with each other. So it's a weird word, because I'd love to get rid of the word boundaries and change it out for something else. And the closest thing I can get to is needs, right? But needs, if you think about it, are vulnerable. Needs are incredibly vulnerable. If I said to Scott, like, because I mean, the truth is, in my life, I need touch, I need affection, I need hugs. And some of the people I need it from the most are actually men. Like, I need close connection with men and affection. And for me, it's non-sexual, but that's actually what I need, is non-sexual, healthy touch from men. And it's really good for me. And so I'd be like, Scott, give me a big hug every time we see each other. And unless he comes up to me and that day I don't, I'm gonna be like, Scott, no hugs today. I don't need that, right? And that's fine. And Scott's like, cool, you don't need it today, right? If I have a good relationship with somebody, they know what I need, and they know, and they can tell me they can give it to me, or they can tell me they can't give it to me, and that's fine. I'm going to be okay. I'll figure out how to get my needs met. But needs are vulnerable. Boundaries are vulnerable. They're intimate. And what does that mean? When I say intimate, I'm talking about emotional intimacy. I'm talking about physical intimacy. I'm talking about relational, spiritual intimacy, right? It's intimacy of all kinds. It's closeness. And so when I'm teaching boundaries to somebody, I'm teaching them about my heart. I'm teaching them about me. And they have a choice whether or not to show up for me. That's fine. In fact, I hope they tell me when they can't show up for me. That feels so much better than them telling me they can show up for me and then they don't, right? So anyway, I'd love to have a discussion on boundaries. Obviously, we can talk about anything we want here, but the other thing about it is, when teaching boundaries, a very like maybe rudimentary understanding of boundaries is that boundaries have consequences. And so people think, well, if I'm going to set a boundary, I have to have a consequence, and I better stick to that consequence. And many of you have heard me say before that boundaries have consequences, but I would argue most boundaries have what we refer to as natural consequences. My brain had to catch up there. Natural consequences, meaning the consequence just happens naturally, right? So if I have friends of mine who, let's say, they kind of have set a boundary with me that they don't want to talk about deep emotional things, then the natural consequence to that is that we have limited emotional intimacy, right? And that's just naturally going to happen. I don't have to go tell them, well, you don't want me close to you emotionally, so we're not going to be very close emotionally. Like, it's obvious. It just happens. Now, there's other boundaries where I have some people who I have said, hey, for whatever reason, I need no touch from you, perhaps, right? Well, in that process, if they touch me, I may have to say, hey, I can't be this close to you if you're going to touch me without asking permission, right? Right, then that would be more of a logical consequence that I let them know. And over time, I might limit my distance and limit my face-to-face connection with them because they're not respecting my touch boundary, right? There may be a lot of other things I do in between there, But I just want to throw that out there. There are natural consequences that occur with helping other people know our needs. There are logical consequences that occur. There are consequences that aren't so logical that we're fumbling around trying to use and teach other people with. So maybe we open up a discussion on boundaries. Maybe we go wherever you guys want to go. But what are your thoughts, Scott?
I love the topic of boundaries. Ask us questions, put them in the Q&A about boundaries or anything else to do with addiction recovery relationships. Matt is an expert on all of that. But I have some questions about boundaries. Normally when I hear talk about boundaries, I rarely hear people talk about them in terms of needs. And I love that you're talking about them in terms of, needs and also wants and preferences, because when I was new to recovery, I was one of those needless, wantless people, because I'll just take care of it myself. And I also had no boundaries. And I kind of learned about my needs, I think, by people crossing boundaries without me even realizing it was a boundary. Do you see that with clients sometimes? Like, I get my hackles up and I realize I have a boundary, and then I have to explore what it is I'm protecting.
Right. Like, yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that, because how do we learn about anything? Right. Like, most things we learn about, and I'm trying to, I don't want to be too extreme, I guess, but like, think about this. Like, how do we learn what foods we like? By trying foods we don't like. Right. Like, how do we learn about what activities we enjoy, what sports we like, whatever? It's by trying it and figuring out what works for us and what doesn't. And so, yes, unfortunately, I don't know how to tell people this. Like, the only way you're going to learn about your needs and your boundaries is by allowing situations to occur. Now, here's what I'm going to be careful you don't run with this in a negative or too far of an unhealthy way, but like, do it with sound judgment, right? Don't go hang out in a dark alley in a shady part of town with dollar bills taped all over you. I'm just trying to make up something silly, right? While screaming at the top of your lungs to see if you like dark alleys, right? Like, I mean, it's totally goofy, but like, use sound judgment. Don't say, well, I need to learn about my boundaries. I'm going to go do this really potentially unhealthy thing so that I can figure out if I like it or not. But absolutely, I think it's really critical. Scott, that was like, woo.
We went off track there a little bit. That's good.
But like, we have to put ourselves carefully into situations to see where our boundaries are at, to figure out, do I need to shift this at all? And I'll tell you, and I'll be very careful with this one because I have a lot of compassion for this one. But let's say there's a space in the relationship, because we deal with a lot of, because I'm a sex addiction therapist. So I deal with a lot of people who have sexual betrayal, sexual trauma in the marriage, right? And so one of those areas is if I have a partner who is let's say hoping they feel safe enough to maybe engage sexually, they have to go put themselves in a scary, vulnerable situation to potentially be sexual. Now, if I know, okay, let's try kissing, let's try making out, right? And I'm able to say, look, this is my boundary at the moment. If I decide I want to move further on this boundary, then I will use my hands and I'll pull you close. And if I do that, well, you can try it unless I tell you, oh, don't do that, I don't like it, right? Like, and here's all these boundary movements, but potentially in a very vulnerable experience, especially when there's been trauma around that type of relationship or that type of behavior within the relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's one of the real points about boundaries that I always try to make with people is you have to become vulnerable. I mean, the whole point of boundaries is not to keep people out; it's to let them in safely.
Yeah.
they have to kind of earn their way in, but you have to become a little bit vulnerable to see if they're going to respect this boundary, and then a little more, until you let them all the way in. And, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship or, any kind of relationship, it's a gradual bringing or opening of the boundaries to let, when you find out they're safe. Um, and I think boundaries within consequences are always misconstrued as, if you cross this boundary, we're never speaking again. And that's not really what we're talking about.
Right. Like, depending on the boundary violation, not speaking ever again might be a logical consequence, right? But I can't tell you how many times I've worked with, let's say, a partner who has told me, especially early in recovery, if my partner ever has a slip again, I'm moving out or I'm asking them to move out. And, in that moment, that feels very real and valid. And in that moment, let's say it totally is valid. But then let's say in a couple of months, their partner has a slip and they go, oh, I have to hold to that boundary because I better do what I say I was going to do. And it's like, but I don't think that's actually what I need. And so now they feel very conflicted. I have to hold to what I said was going to be my consequence. Otherwise, it looks like I'm weak or my boundaries don't matter. And I try to encourage people, your boundary is about your need. It's not about a consequence. And so I can say to somebody that my boundary is, I'm going to tell you no, but then in that moment, the violation happens. And not only do I say no, but you need to leave because I need some space. Don't come back for 30 minutes, right? If my need changes when the boundary violation occurs, I need to be true to my need, whether it's more than I said it was going to be or less, because what the issue is what is my actual need? That's the piece that needs to be tended to, not only by myself, but by the other person. So it's really important that, one, we get to know ourselves, but this is a really awkward process.
But what you just explained, though, is why I love this framing of boundaries in terms of needs. I'm actually going to go back and rewrite some old articles of mine to add this, because I think it needs to be there. I think it's really important. So
you got to footnote me then.
Yeah, I will footnote you. Yes, I will. I won't even footnote you. I'll mention you in the actual text.
I'm actually kidding, but right, like this is the part that when I've explained it to people, and for the longest time, I kept trying to figure out the concept of boundaries, and I got to a place where I realized I hate the term, but I don't know that I have. It's so widely used within healing communities. I don't know that I can easily change it. Maybe I need to call Rob and say, hey, prodependence was a great term. What term do we have for boundaries? Because
that means Rob and I have to write another book. No. I need a break.
Well, no. See if I could come up with the word. Maybe I could write the book.
There you go. But it really is about needs, and particularly the need for safety in relationships. I think, particularly when we're talking about romantic. Now, I have a couple more questions for you, and then we're going to get to the Q&A.
No, get it. Let's you and I go there.
Okay, so one of them is particularly with betrayed partners, when they try to set boundaries, they can get resistance. And in any relationship, any family without boundaries, when somebody comes in and wants to actually start being healthy with boundaries or needs or whatever we want to call them, there can be resistance. How do you help clients work through that resistance? Because Brene Brown says, people will appreciate it, but they won't act like it when you try to set boundaries with them.
Well, yeah, because how do I say this? If I come to you and say, hey, Scott, my need is that we change the webinar time 10 minutes before, and we're going to randomize it, right? You're going to be irritated, like, oh my gosh, like, it's going to create chaos, right? And so the tough part is if I were to tell you my need, you might feel like, why are you making my life more difficult? Right. And so The problem is we take each other's needs personally, right? As if it's somehow an offense that I've caused or created. When the truth is, it's my need. As odd as it may be, you have an option to say, I can help you with that, or I can't help you with that, or let me think about that, or here's how much I can do, here's what I'm willing to try, right? Like, we take other people's needs as a personal affront, or sometimes we take it as like, oh my gosh, if you're asking me for that need, you must really like me or something. Like, we take it as our own personal self-esteem boost, when no, it's just your preference. So the issue is, we have to really explore with each other, why is it that my need is somehow confronting your, I hate to say it, but your ego or your wound. Like, why does my preference for this create a problem for you around that? Right? Why does it have anything other to do with you, other than you're a person in my life who I trust enough to say, help me? So I don't know if that answers it.
Well, I mean, that is the situation. But I mean, how do you help somebody, like a couple who's struggling with this? How do you walk them through that?
Well, so let me say the same thing in a different way.
Okay.
In that moment, when there is conflict, when I've presented a need and there is conflict, I'm now going to stop and get present with the conflict.
Okay.
So I'm literally going to stop and say, hey, I can tell that my asking you to show up for me in this way has created some sort of a conflict. Can you help me understand why it's bringing up this conflict for you? Now, they have to, sometimes they'll get snarky. What do you mean, why? You just asked me to do this. I understand that. And what about me asking you to do that is difficult? What do you mean, why is it difficult? I mean, of course it's difficult for me to do this, right? I understand that you see this as difficult. Help me understand your perspective, right? So I'm going to try and stay in that with them. And it's going to be weird because I'm the one coming with a need. And now what we're addressing is your barrier or your need that is in conflict with mine. And sometimes we have to do that. Now, again, when you're dealing with addiction and other issues, this could easily be seen as a turning of the tables. And I don't know that that's necessarily what's happening. It could be misdirection, and I totally want to use another word that I can't remember, but it could be a distraction.
Deflecting, or
yeah. Deflecting, that was the word. I knew it started with a D. That was amazing. And it totally could be a deflection, but at the same time, I think we have to run with that sometimes to figure out what is getting in the way of me getting my needs met and you getting your needs met. And if we just get into an argument about how illogical the other person is for not understanding me, we're going to miss our opportunity to actually show up for each other. So let's dive into what are the barriers, what's actually preventing this, rather than getting caught up in the content that really isn't helpful.
Thank you. I promise I'm going to get to the questions in the Q&A and in the chat, but I have one more question.
Another question. All right, get it.
And this one is sort of off topic, but you mentioned your need for male connection, and I have that very same need for male connection. And I know that in my addiction, I had no male connection. I often, when I'm teaching my online work groups or just, working with somebody, or sometimes even in a meeting, I'll ask, if it's a room full of men, how many of you have an actual best friend? And almost nobody raises a hand. And the ones that do, I question them, and then it's like a work buddy. It's not a best friend. Why do men not have best friends? And do we really need them? And what are the barriers to that? And that's a huge question. So talk as little or as much as you want.
Do you know what was so funny? I when I was actually training to be a certified sex addiction therapist, I had well, one of my supervisors is a fantastic clinician. I absolutely adore her. Her name is Deb Kaplan. She lives in Tucson, Arizona.
I love Deb.
Oh my gosh. And Deb, it was so funny because I did my supervision with another therapist. His name is Kyle Reed. He lives up in Utah. And we would do these supervision sessions together. And there were times that like Kyle and I were hashing things out together. And Kyle's one of my best friends. And she would actually comment very frequently, like, "Oh my gosh, you guys have such a good relationship. Like you guys like really and really connect and like you talk with each other on such a deep emotional level." And it was so funny because it was surprise, like I don't know that it was surprising to her, but enough that she commented on it. And at one point she actually said, "Guys, before we start, I need to tell you about this podcast I just listened to." And it's called the podcast is called The Hidden Brain. It's on NPR, but the episode is called The Lonely American Man, if I remember right.
Great podcast episode. I've listened to it, and I believe that's what it's called, The Lonely American Man or Male. It's one or the other.
Yeah, or Lonely American Men. And there's like another article in Harper's Bazaar that from a couple years ago that was like, you know, lonely men and the women who bear the burden. They're legitimately, in my opinion, I mean, talk about a pandemic or an epidemic. There is a real issue within male society of loneliness, and we could talk. I mean, you and I could do webinar after webinar discussing a lot of this, and I've done a decent amount of research on it in the sense that even for my own healing, right? And I mean, the tough part is I don't know exactly what question you're asking, but I ask as one of my intake questions, as far as I can tell, every time I meet with somebody, who's your best friend? And almost universally, a man will say,
My
my wife,
wife.
right? Or my spouse, right? And so almost universally, that's what they'll tell me. And that typically I ask that as a data question. And then I'll ask, if they tell me my wife, I'll say, who else? Right. And the number of times that they're like, well, nobody, right? Like she's supposed to be my best friend. And I'm like, it's interesting. Even the supposed to be, right? Supposed to be my best friend,
Dumping
right?
all of our needs onto one person who can't possibly meet them all.
Oh my gosh, no way can that person meet them all. Here's the other thing, right? Like I remember first getting married and like in a way doing the same thing, putting all my needs on my wife, and my wife's like I can't, no, I don't want to go mountain biking. Get out of here. Like,
Well,
and
go make friends.
yeah, go make friends. Go, like, I know you have friends. Go find them, right? Like, and and it was hard, I think, for a while to get into that mindset of like, the truth is not only, yeah, having your spouse be your best friend is a great thing, but like not all my best friends have the same interests. Like, in fact, some of my best friends are my best friends for biking, and some of them are my best friends for talking, and some of them are my best friends for running, like whatever it is, right? Like we have best friends for different needs and different reasons. And so, I mean, the boundary conversation relates to all of this as well, right? Because we have to teach other people, we have to teach other men or other women or whatever, what our needs are, not just our spouse. We got to teach our children what our boundaries are as well. So I have no idea if I just answered your question. I don't think
I
I
think you
did.
did. I just kind of wanted to explore it a little bit. I mean, I have this really powerful belief that male friendships are devalued in our society in a way that is very, very harmful to most of the men in our society.
And I would agree. The causes for that devaluation, I think, are still being researched.
Yeah.
But I do think that it is a lot more socially acceptable for men to or for women to have friends than it is for men. And unfortunately for men, I think oftentimes it's like, oh, well, these are my drinking buddies, like and the hard part is that if you're drinking, making emotional connection is not as connected because you're under the influence of a substance.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, totally. Okay, let's get to questions. I have monopolized 34 minutes of our webinar. This is from someone, female, who is separated from her partner, but they still have some communication. She says, I don't feel safe as he has access to lots of things he can act out to, and I have told him I don't feel safe. So my boundary is that I stay away until I see any change or he offers that safety. Is this a good boundary to set in place?
Great question. Not an easy answer. So remember, your boundary is about a need. And this is something I think is so fantastic. I love that you asked the question because it just popped into my head. If our boundary is ever about teaching somebody a lesson, it's not a boundary. That it is not a boundary. So if I want to make Scott change, and I'm going to create a boundary so that he knows I'm upset so that he changes, that's not a boundary. At that point, I'm just trying to control him. Does that make sense? So when you look at what a boundary is about me getting need fulfillment. And so if my need, the other thing that I will say that a lot of my partners early in recovery, I don't say this to them because it's going to sound difficult and maybe even harsh, but the truth is we overuse the word safety, right? I need safety. Well, the truth is that could be so many different things to so many different people. It's like saying, I was going to say needing to breathe, but that's pretty basic, right? Like I'm hungry, right? It's like, okay, for what? I'm hungry for what, right? I need safety. Well, if we don't even understand what safety is, it's an exploration, right? Like one person can be safe with their partner who acts out with pornography occasionally, and another person isn't, right? Like safe in the same home. One person is okay as long as their spouse isn't acting out sexually outside the home. Like there's so many different things where it could be depending on the needs of each individual. So when you say that, let's see, he still has access to lots of things and he can act out, and I have told him I don't feel safe. The tough part is with that, if somebody said, I don't feel safe, I'm going to be like, well, with what, right? Like, help me understand what your specific needs are. And if it's like, well, you're never allowed to act out again. Well, then it's like, well, shoot, like you're right. Acting out isn't healthy. There's never an excuse for it. But at the same time, there's a process of healing occurring. So basically, are you telling me you don't feel safe until I've figured out my recovery and then I come back into the relationship, right? That could take years, right? So if that's where your boundary really is, then you're going to probably, my suggestion is you're going to really need to explore what safety really means and looks like. Is it that you still have access on your phone? So are you suggesting that he has a dumb phone, or he or she has a dumb phone, right? Like what? And even then, that's you saying, look, here's what I think I need. Then they have a choice whether or not that they can comply with that, right?
My boundaries are about me and my behavior. If I want Matt to do something, I have to say, Matt, I would feel better if you got a dumb phone so that you didn't have access to all of that stuff. And if you don't get one, I will move out of the house. I mean, it's still about me. I mean, he still has the choice to keep his iPhone.
Right. Right. And the tough part is, again, we're not trying to, I always have to be careful because it's like, or I'll move out of the house. I mean, it could be, I'm going to sleep in another bedroom. It could be we're going to sleep in the same bed, but I don't feel comfortable being sexually intimate, right? Like it could be any number of things. And whatever it is depends on what your need is. So you
Yeah,
ask.
I've worked with people where, the boundary is when we go to bed at night, you will hand me your phone and I will put it under the mattress on my side of the bed. You can keep your iPhone, but I want to know you're not waking up at 2 a.m. and looking at porn or chatting with people,
Right. While I'm asleep, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, I need your phone while you're sleeping so that I feel safe enough to be able to fall asleep and whatever, right? And so when you ask that question, is this a good boundary?
Yeah.
Is it meeting your need? Right? And sometimes if you think this is your boundary, but what you're finding is you're lonely and you want him back in your life, well, then you might have to explore that your need for safety here might be preventing your other needs from being met, and they may be conflicting somehow until you're able to figure out something better that works. So I feel like I've answered your question, but done it in a really big way. And so unless we got deeper into the specifics, I think that's about as much as I can answer.
Yeah, let's go to the next one here. My husband and I are living apart currently. We are both working with our own therapists on ourselves. My husband lies, manipulates, gaslights, emotionally cheats, etc. I'm working on having stronger boundaries. My husband must be learning about boundaries as well because he laid a boundary of no longer wanting to continue a conversation that was emotionally charged. I totally respected that he no longer wanted to continue that conversation. I agreed with it that we needed to take a step back, but I feel like he laid this boundary of stepping out of the conversation, but there's no follow-up time or suggestion. When I suggested another time to speak, he just dismissed and avoided the question. I feel like he just uses this boundary to avoid situations he doesn't want to be in, but under the cover of a boundary. Any advice on how to deal with someone who may be weaponizing boundaries?
Well, again, when we're all learning boundaries, in essence, I think we all kind of weaponize boundaries because it's like we're just trying to figure out how to use the dang thing. I don't know if that makes sense. I think in this case, I'm going to get rid of the word boundaries for a second. He says, my need is to not continue this emotionally charged conversation. And then I can lean in and say, okay, thank you so much for letting me know your need. I can feel that it probably is my need as well. And what I am concerned about is that if we don't follow up with this conversation at some point, either together or with a therapist, maybe as a couple, or if we don't choose to process this with our own therapist and then try to resolve it together, that I'm going to build up resentment and I'm going to feel abandoned, right? Okay, so if you hear what I'm saying, these are natural consequences. I'm not saying I'm going to resent you, right? I'm not saying, what was the other thing I said besides resentment? I can't remember. So, I'm going to have resentment, and I might pull away because now I'm feeling like we can't talk about painful things when we need to talk about them, right? Now, if you hear me, I'm actually leaning back in with more of my own boundaries. But all I'm actually doing, why I don't like the word boundaries, is all I'm doing is actually leaning back with, hey, I totally appreciate that this is what's going on for you. But if it goes this direction, I'm worried about where it's going to take us long term. Here's what I'm nervous about. So yes, let's not go into this conversation right now. Let's both get some help around it and let's revisit it together. And if we don't, then it's going to feel like avoidance. We're not going to have the closeness of connection. And ultimately, we're going to drift apart and not stay together anyway. I don't suggest you throw all that out, by the way, because then it sounds like you're threatening. But realizing and expressing those needs, whether in that moment or the next day, I think would be very important for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, worst case scenario, you can say, I have therapy later today. You have therapy tomorrow morning. Let's talk about this at dinner tomorrow night. I mean, but set a time to continue the conversation as you're stepping away from the heat. I mean, does that make sense? I mean, that's kind of what you suggested.
Absolutely. But that's all about helping the other person understand needs.
Yes. Two questions. Can you post the name of the podcast you talked about? What was the name of the podcast again?
The podcast is called The Hidden Brain.
I'll look it up.
And one episode, it's just one episode that's called Lonely American Man. And it's on NPR, like npr.org. And you just do a search, Hidden Brain, Lonely American Man, and it'll be so easy to find.
Yeah,
it's
I'm gonna look it up, and I'll post a link to it while you answer this question. So the second question here is, I've started a list of boundaries based on my core values. One, for example, is the value of honesty and transparency. But I need help with matching the degree or weight of the slip with my degree or choice of consequences. Any resources to help offer ideas for these levels of minimal offense to a big offense?
Yeah. So first of all, it's tough because I always struggle with like a list of consequences, right? What I encourage you to do is ask yourself, why are you stating a consequence? State the boundary, and when the violation occurs, if you have an idea of in your mind what you need, that's helpful because you can revisit it and try it in that moment, right? Now, if they ask, let's say for a minute, you said honesty and transparency, okay? So let's say you ask a question and it's, hey, were you able to stop by the store and pick that thing up for me, right? And they say, yes. And then they get home 20 minutes after you were expecting them to, and you put the pieces together that they didn't actually do it and they ran late and just so that they could get it. And then basically they lied to you about getting it, and then they are late coming home, right? Does that make sense? So you find out that they've been lying, right? So then in that moment, you're able to say, hey, if you think about it, my need is transparency and honesty. So I say, hey, you're late, and I see that you have this thing that I asked for. Did you stop and get it after we talked? And they say, yes, I did, right? Well, the consequence might be, wow, I'm disappointed. How come you told me you got it when you didn't, right? The consequence is I'm now asking you questions about why you weren't honest, right? That in some sense, that's the consequence. And nobody likes that feeling typically, right? That was disappointing to me. Why did you do this, right? And then let's say that it's bigger. Let's say you find out from a polygraph, or you find out the day before a polygraph, hey, I need to tell you I had a slip and I didn't tell you about it, right? Well, in that case, they weren't honest. They're only being honest because there's a scheduled polygraph tomorrow and they don't want to get in trouble. Well, they're going to get in trouble anyway, if that makes sense, trouble within the relationship. And in that case, I might say, you know what, that's really disappointing. I'm really glad you told me. And, I just want you to know that for right now, I can't do sexual intimacy because I don't feel comfortable allowing sexual intimacy when I'm with somebody who's not being honest with me. I can't be physically honest if you're not emotionally honest. And I'm just making this up because I have no idea what your particular needs are. So can I give you a list of consequences that match the degree or weight of the slip? No, because one person's slip may have a degree of consequence for you that is much greater than somebody else. Does that make you wrong or bad? Absolutely not. It makes you human. It makes you normal, right? Each of us. So it may feel frustrating that I'm saying this, but I almost don't want to give you a list of, if this happens, you need to do this, right? Because then I'm telling you what your needs are. You don't want me telling you what your needs are. You don't want anybody telling you what your needs are. You need to go figure them out. So, Scott, what do you think as I say this?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think trauma in general, any kind of trauma is highly subjective. The example I use is, a new mother with her baby in the car seat in the back seat, and she pulls up to a stop line and somebody bumps her from behind. She's going to freak out. Whereas a NASCAR driver, a guy who hits the wall 180 miles an hour like twice a month, he's going to get bumped and he's going to look out and go, whatever. It's just subjective. One person is going to be highly traumatized by something that another person is going to be like, what? I didn't even notice. So, and I think
Right.
it's that way with emotional stuff too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're all just wired differently and we're all going to respond differently. So
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Absolutely. So I love the question because the question itself is seeking understanding. So it's a beautiful question. The hard part is there's no answer. So if you were to ask me a question, if somebody punched you in the arm, what would your consequence be? Well, I might have an answer for you, but it would be with a lot of other questions like, well, are you like hard enough to leave a bruise? Or, like I need to understand the gravity, right? Which is measurable by a bruise, maybe, to what my response would be. If somebody punches me in the arm, I might not have a response at all. Somebody else punches me in the arm, depending on how hard it is or who it is, and I might have a completely different response. So it's a wonderful question and such a personalized answer. So
Yeah, okay, let's go to this next one. I find your talk about males and best friends very interesting. This is from a male. My spouse recently said that my best friend doesn't count as someone who can help me with my feelings if my best friend hasn't also had an affair like I have had. So am I supposed to start asking other friends if they've had an affair so I can identify who she's comfortable with me talking to? I think that's a really interesting question.
it is a really interesting question. And I have, oh boy, it's really funny. I've got to sit with this for a second because I felt a bit of an emotional response come up here because there's a couple of things that I hear you saying. And what I hear you saying is, and if I'm reading too much into this, please clarify, but I almost hear you saying, I have to figure out who my wife's wife,
Yeah, I think
spouse,
yes.
spouse, who my spouse is comfortable with me talking to. Now, I think it's important that we have these conversations, that we respect the needs of our spouse. There's no doubt. But at the same time, the real question here is your best friend helping you? Right? Regardless of what your spouse thinks, is your best friend showing up for you and helping you? Or are you going to ask friends if they've had an affair, in essence, to appease your spouse? Now, first of all, I think that's a fundamentally flawed concept. If no one could understand us unless they've gone through what we've gone through, then there would be no one on earth who could understand anybody, because no two people have gone through the exact same life experience, right? The idea of empathy is that we have an understanding of what that would be like. So I have never lost a child after childbirth. Okay. But at the same time, I'm well acquainted with pain of loss. So I believe I can imagine, I can have some degree of empathy of how painful or difficult that might be. However, I wouldn't necessarily tell somebody I know exactly what it's like, but I think I have enough empathy that I could feel with a person. I think I have enough empathy that I could cry with a person and feel how painful to some degree how painful that loss would be. But so I don't think we need to go find people, and I don't necessarily think we have to make sure our spouse is completely comfortable with everybody who's helping us. Now, I don't think we should be flippant and say Matt the therapist, Matt the YouTube therapist. I'm sorry, I think I'm funny. He said that this is the case, right? Like, no, be respectful and figure out why that might be an issue for your spouse. But at the same time,
go ahead.
At the same time, could it be helpful for you to find a friend who had an affair? Sure, absolutely, that could be helpful. Especially if your best friend's like, I don't get it. I don't understand. I could never do something like that, right? Yes, it could be very beneficial, but I don't necessarily think it has to be that way.
And if you want to find that person without questioning every friend you have and outing yourself to every friend you have, maybe go to a 12-step sexual recovery meeting,
right,
or one of the drop-in groups for men on sex and relationship healing, because you will find lots of empathetic, knowledgeable support in those settings from guys who've been through very similar situations. So yeah, I mean, I agree that it's very helpful to have somebody who's been through it, but like Matt said, you don't have to have been through it to understand what's going on and to be supportive. So, anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a great question, and I think and keep in mind the reason you're wanting to make her or him comfortable is because you care about them. And so the desire to make them comfortable is phenomenal because that's rooted in your love, which again, we don't ever want to put that down. There's nothing wrong with that. However, we do need to have a conversation that my recovery can't be about trying to make you comfortable first and then figuring out how to make recovery work. So definitely we seek to provide as much comfort and safety for our partners as possible. So good job there.
I'm going to skip to this next question here because we've also got one in the chat feature that looks a lot like it. So okay. I'm going to ask the one out of the Q&A. How do you resolve conflicting boundaries? Like if my spouse says that he or she needs X, but X is directly opposed to a need I have, or is taking away aspects of my life that are important to me, or the removal of them diminishes my integrity or who I feel I am as a person. So, deeply.
It's actually a really good question because the truth is we have conflicting needs at times, right? And without a specific example, it's, I'll try and come up with something. It's always a little easier if I have very specific examples, but then those specific examples typically will only apply to that example, but or my response would only apply to that. But let's say, for instance, because I'll just make something up. So Thursday night, one spouse wants to go spend time with friends and the other spouse wants to go spend time with friends, but somebody's got to stay home with the kids, right? So we both have needs. We're not able to get a sitter. One of us has to go without, right? So in that case, we have a conversation. Hey, my needs are coming up. Your needs are coming up. Can we talk about ways we can work together? Like, can one of us go and the other one go next week? Or can even though it won't be as fulfilling, could you go with your friends on Friday night? Maybe less people could go. Whatever it is, let's have a conversation, because the truth is we're going to have competing needs. Let's work together with the recognition that I want you to meet your needs and you want me to meet my needs. And we do have some of those that compete at times. And so I may have to go without my need in this moment, but if we're working together, that feels really good. And I know that you're not telling me I don't deserve to go. You're not telling me, but we recognize that this is just how life is. So let's work together to figure out how to fulfill each other's needs as best we can as a team. So it becomes this, it's not me versus you, it's life. It's us versus life. It's us versus competing circumstances, if that makes sense. So I don't know.
I'm a big believer in let's stop fighting each other and start fighting the problem. And the problem is, 2 nights from now, we both have something that we really want to do and maybe even need to do, and they both can't happen. So that's the problem. Let's figure out how to deal with the problem. And so instead of yelling at each other, we can work toward resolution. And I think you used the word team. We're on the same team.
Right.
And I think relationships, it's inevitable that two people in relationship are going to have conflicts. They're going to argue, but can we respectfully reach some sort of compromise?
Right.
Can we be on the same team? And the team goal is to win for the team, not for myself or yourself.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's wonderful.
And obviously it's complicated, right? It depends on the circumstance. I've seen people where their needs are so competing and it feels so impossible to resolve that they ultimately agree to get a divorce. And that's what divorce is. We can't compromise. And in order to be healthy and happier, that's at least the idea behind it, we are going to dissolve our team relationship and go find other teams. Right? Like, and I'm not saying I'm advocating for that. I'm saying that that's the idea behind we've got needs. We married each other to fulfill needs. We stay married to fulfill needs. Can we figure out how to do that best together as a team?
Yeah. We're out of time. This was an incredible webinar. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for the great questions. Matt, thank you for the great topic and the great discussion and for indulging my questions.
Yeah.
And, we will be back in 2 weeks. I hope you'll join us. I'm glad you found us, despite some of us having a time change and some of us, Matt, not, because he lives in Arizona.
Because Arizona is the only place that doesn't change. No, there's another place.
Yeah, so, and I think that's the way it should be, but that is completely off topic for our webinar. Anything you want to say to take us out, Matt?
No, you guys are awesome. I love the questions. Thanks for giving me your vulnerability. And if we want to do this topic again next time, let's do it.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we'll see you in a couple of weeks, everybody.
Bye.